Good morning. My name is Tine, and I'm here to talk to you about fragile states. So for the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to convince you why you should care about fragile states and why they impact and understanding how they impact all of your work. So I'm going to talk about three things as part of my argument. The first is, what is state fragility? Figure we should all have a common definition. The second is why it matters for all our work. I know sometimes people think, oh, it's just humanitarian workers or, weirdo cowboy workers, development workers who do fragile states, but I'm going to convince you, I hope by the end of this, that you should care. And the third thing I'm going to talk about is why tenacity, the theme of this conference, is so important for addressing state fragility and for working in fragile states. But first, I screwed it up already. Okay. First, I want to tell you a story about a painting. Seems like a strange way to start, but so I keep this painting on my desk at work. And everybody at DAI where I work knows that if they come into the office and this painting is not on my desk, it means I've quit and I'm never coming back. So why is this painting so important to me? Well, because it represents something, the most profound or meaningful thing I've accomplished in my professional career. So I worked in Jordan about 10 years ago, and as part of my work there, I had the opportunity to help the government of Jordan shape an entirely new way of addressing living conditions of adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So up until that point, there had been sort of an institutionalization of adults with IDD. And we managed to convince the government of Jordan to start a group home approach to it. So as part of that, we took the government of Jordan, we took disability rights activists, we took service providers, we took a lot of folks from the US, brought them to Jordan to help, and then we did the same, bringing folks from Jordan to the US to help. And we were visiting a group home, and you can see it's a landscape painting, and so a man who had lived his whole adult life in this group home in New York State, he gave me the painting and he said, this is a view from my window. And I'm so excited that you're going to give a view like this that people can paint in Jordan to other people. So I keep this. So what the heck does this have to do with fragile states and my talk about fragile states? So I believe that this story about this painting and the government of Jordan wanting to move to providing the best possible services to some of the most vulnerable citizens is at the core of what makes one state resilient and another state fragile. So we all know what the extremes of state fragility look like, failed states. We turn on the news, we see Syria, we see Somalia, we see Yemen. But state fragility is a sort of more nuanced thing than the spectacular failures we see on the news. So I'd argue that state fragility, and conversely state resilience, is a direct result of the way in which governments and societies do or do not, can or cannot, serve the best interests of their citizens, particularly their most vulnerable citizens. So let me say that again. Fragility and resilience, the converse of fragility, directly come from the ability of societies and government to serve all of their citizens, particularly the most vulnerable. So going back to Jordan and the painting, Jordan is an example of a country which, if you look at the neighborhood it's in, has a lot of the things that you would think would make it a fragile state. However, for the most part, the government of Jordan does put first serving the interests of its citizens, particularly the vulnerable citizens. And so through that, Jordan has managed to be a relatively resilient country. Syria, right next door, through deliberate actions on the part of the government, managed to become a failed state. And then Somalia, through a lack of resources, a lack of capacity, also managed to become. So there's the deliberate failed state and there's the accidental failed state. So now that I've talked a little bit about what makes a state fragile or what makes a state resilient, I'd like to talk about my second point, which is, why does this matter to all of us in this room? And I'll make a simple case that comes from when I used to work in retail, which is, if you break it, you buy it. We all told our kids that. We've all had our mothers tell us that. So what do I mean by that? If the work that we do, whether it's community advocacy, health, I do counterterrorism, education, whatever it is the work that we do, if it does not in some way, shape, or form support society or government to serve the best interests of their citizens, then we might be breaking it. And boy, we're going to pay for it if we do that. This is why I so strongly believe in a multidisciplinary approach, a systems-based approach to development work. So for all of us, we tend to look down in our daily work. So we look down at what we're doing, we look down at what we're good at, we look down at what we know. My argument is that you need to look up. And a multidisciplinary systems-based approach to whatever we do allows us to look up and out and understand the big picture, and helps us do no harm, helps us avoid unintended consequences. And it lets us fit the pieces together in a way that gives us, perhaps, and hopefully, a better result. So I'm going to give a quick example from the work that I currently do as part of DAI's Center for Secure and Stable States. So it's a project in Myanmar, and the goal of the project, one of the goals of the project, is to support the peace process. So I don't know how much folks know about Myanmar, but it's one of the more complex conflicts or fragile state situation in the world. So it has dozens, literally, of ethnic armed groups that are fighting each other, sometimes fighting the government. At any given day, it can change. You also have religious extremism. You have Buddhist religious extremism. You have Islamic religious extremism. You have a government that's far from being democratic in either its principles or its practices. And then you have this all against a backdrop of really poor development indicators, whether you're looking at health, education, economic growth, livelihoods. So in our work, we're sort of constantly having to look systemically and through a multidisciplinary lens at this action we're taking, this group we're supporting, whether it's to bring them to peace negotiations or to help implement the parts of the peace accord that are active. What are the consequences of us doing that, both good and bad? And how will those consequences play out to either make Myanmar more resilient or more fragile? So I'm now going to try and connect this all back to the theme of the conference, which is tenacity. And I think tenacity is essential. So at the macro level, looking at fragile states, you need tenacity because this work is hard. It's very often unpleasant. It's very often complex. It's just plain old hard. It requires well-coordinated, multidisciplinary approaches, a systems approach that enables you to understand how the pieces fit together. But then on an individual level, as at the end of the day, it all comes down to me, or to you, or to the person you're working with. It's stressful work. So I've been doing this, working on fragile states, since 1990, either directly or indirectly. And there are days when I think about taking my painting and walking away and becoming the fitness coach for the LA Lakers, which is my dream job. But I don't, mostly because the Lakers haven't called yet. But also because it can be the most meaningful work. When you realize that what you did today, or yesterday, or what you might do a year from now, is going to fundamentally help strengthen the situation of folks who are the most vulnerable, because really that's what our goal should be as development professionals or as community organizers or as humans. It makes you not quit and take your painting and go home. But I think that the kind of tenacity it takes to do that is a very specific kind of tenacity. It's something called Sisu. So I'm Norwegian, and I'll start out by saying the Finns are not Scandinavian, okay? But the concept of Sisu comes from Finland, and it's a Finnish concept, and it means, the loosest, best translation I've heard is tenacity of purpose. So I believe that cultivating Sisu in ourselves and in our work is how we'll get to the point where I'm not standing in front of you talking about fragile and failed states, where I'm only talking to you about what is successful and what is working, as opposed to, the situation in a lot of places. So as a takeaway from today, I want to challenge everybody in the room just 2 small things, if I've made my case. And that is, 1, think about how you can ensure that your work empowers societies, people, states to be more resilient and less fragile. And then the second is, how can you cultivate Sisu in yourselves, in your colleagues, and in order to sort of gain purpose and meaning over the long term in your work? So I thank you very much for your time today, and I hope I've made my case.